Hi, I wanted to tell a story today about something that happened in my past. Let's see where this goes. Back in 1969, my dad went to Vietnam. So we had to move. We were a military family, Air Force family, and they didn't have any housing for us. So we had to basically go to Kansas City, Missouri, and live with my grandmother for a year while my dad was in Vietnam. And my grandmother had bought her house either in 57 or 58 in a neighborhood which back then was a nice middle class neighborhood. But by the time we got there, it had become a ghetto. It was pretty bad. Her house seemed nice. Discovered things during the year that let us know it was not necessarily as nice as we hoped it was. But the neighborhood was pretty much a disaster. And the school I went to was a disaster. I went to an all-black school except for one Mexican kid, and I don't remember his name. I only actually saw him a few times, so I think he was there all year long, but I really don't know. Anyway, it was a total culture shock, which might sound odd being black, but I was a military kid. I had lived on military bases. I'd gone to a Japanese school. I went to a school off base when I lived in North Syracuse, where, it was majority white, but it was way more mixed than going to an all-black school. And it was an interesting culture shock on that level. It was an interesting culture shock because every morning for about the first hour to hour and a half, the teacher would grab certain kids and take them into the back bathroom, because each classroom had its own bathroom, and wash them and clean them and do their hair. And sometimes you would hear kids kicking and screaming over that. And it turns out that there were a lot of those kids who wore the exact same clothes to school every single day. Their parents obviously didn't care enough to even get them new clothes or to clean them up. So the teachers did it. And that had to be embarrassing as sin. And at the same time, we also used to have cards. I didn't have any because, oddly enough, we had money. For military families, don't get paid all that much money, but we had money. So my breakfast and lunch weren't covered, but a lot of the kids came in and they had these little tickets, and lunch was only 15 cents. I don't know how much breakfast was because I ate breakfast at home. And that was sometimes the only meal those kids ate every day. And they were also way behind me as far as education goes. For instance, I got there in fifth grade, and I left fifth grade. I'd only basically had a month, I think, and we were starting to do some, at least for fifth grade, complex math, and we were studying all kind of history and doing all these things. Well, I get out to Kansas City, they're still learning how to add. They haven't even figured out subtracting yet. They were still reading Dick and Jane books. This is fifth grade. Forget history. English, they were just basically still learning how to write. And the reason is you couldn't send books home with those kids. There was no such thing as homework in a ghetto school. You'd never get those books back. You never knew what kind of condition they would come back in. So there was never any homework. So it was a totally different environment I get into. Obviously, I'm an odd duck. And it's really the only time in my life that I experienced massive bullying. Not that I didn't have some bullies later on in my life, but it was a rare thing. But in essence, the majority of the school wanted to kill me. They wanted to beat me up. I was different. They thought I was rich because my mother brushed my hair every day and I wore new clothes to school every day, which is just how my mother went to school when she was a kid. So this was their thing. And they wanted to beat me up for that. They wanted to beat me up because I was too far ahead. And it got to a point where my great-grandmother dragged my mother to school because my mother was depressed and worried about me. My great-grandmother dragged my mother to school, went to the principal and said nothing better happened to my great-grandson while my granddaughter's husband is in Vietnam fighting for his country. You better protect him or there will be trouble. So, an episode that I forgot until maybe 30 years later, maybe even 40 years later, is they held an assembly. And the assembly was held in the gymnasium. And they held an assembly and brought all the kids in the school there, brought me up on stage, and the principal said, his father is in Vietnam fighting for this country. There better not be anything that happens to him or there will be trouble. And I don't remember it at all. I totally blocked it. And then they did something quite extraordinary. They took me out of class. So I still had to go to school every day. I had to check in because that's a federal mandate, but I didn't go to class. So after probably the first 2 or 3 weeks, I never went to another class again. What did I do? I spent time either with the principal or vice principal running errands throughout the school, or I spent all my time in the library, which was interesting because that meant I could read all I wanted to. I loved reading. And I'm the one at 10 years old. Think about this. At 10 years old, I reorganized the library into the Dewey Decimal System. Think about that for a moment. I had to have something to do. So I did it. They had just, put books anywhere. No one knew how to ever find a book, but they had them all numbered and everything. So I did it. And I think that's kind of incredible that I even had that thought. And two, I think it's incredible that I didn't have any classes for an entire year. Now, not having any classes for an entire year also did some other things. After a while, I started to recognize that there were a couple of kids who were on my side. There are some kids who actually stood up to other kids and got suspended for protecting me, which I appreciate that. There were only a couple of times where I was in a spot where, okay, how am I going to get out of this? And we actually won a science award, our school, because I took the lead and asked a couple of kids who I wasn't on the worst terms with if they would help me. And it was the first time that school had ever won any kind of science award. They just never won one. They never even entered anything into a program in Kansas City. I discovered that I was somewhat good at sports. How good can you be at 10 years old? But it turns out I was a little better because I guess I was the only one who'd ever played a sport. They didn't really play sports. We didn't go to gym. There was no gym class. There was recess, and there was a basketball pole out there, but no one had a ball. I guess the teachers didn't trust those kids, so there was nothing like that. And what ended up happening, very odd, my dad came back from Vietnam early. He had pulled his arm out of the socket. He had to come back to the States, have an operation. I didn't know he was coming back, but my mother turned out that she knew. So dad shows up at the house one day, and I'm just screaming, "Oh my God, dad's here, dad's here," because had no idea he was coming back early. And the first day of school, after he came back, he went to school with me, and he was in a half body cast. And we get into the school, and these kids, all of a sudden, everything changed because they thought he'd been shot in Vietnam wearing this body cast or half body cast, and he didn't say anything different. All of a sudden, now I'm Mr. Popular. The kid who they always hated, now all of a sudden I'm popular because he got shot. That's a very interesting way of thinking about stuff. But then, you know what? It was a rough neighborhood. You saw cops all the time. Once we saw a cop two cops pull a gun on a guy who was trying to run down by our house, and we all had to jerk back in. Then the cops came to the door, wanted to ask us questions. We didn't know anything. I saw how some of the other kids lived after a while, and that, is the kind of thing that will put an impression in your mind. I think I've had a pretty charmed life, except for that year in Kansas City. And even there, I learned how to play piano. I started taking piano lessons. I, was taken to some other places where I got to meet kids who didn't go to my school, who were fairly nice. That was the year Kansas City won the Super Bowl. And so I got, Kansas City Chiefs hat. And it gave me a little bit of a feeling of social responsibility. I did not leave Kansas City hating those kids. Like I said, they had kind of changed once Dad came back. I left realizing that there are just people who really have it worse than us, and we don't necessarily see it. And we may think that they're lazy and that they're idiots and they don't care. You know what? Some of those kids were brilliant, but they just didn't have time to learn anything. You get embedded with whatever your family does. So if your parents don't care about you, why do you care about you? And it was just an interesting thing. And that's how come every once in a while I will try to help as I can. Now, I don't go into the city all that often, at least into the bad parts, because I still have a relatively nice car. I stand out. I try not to stand out. When I was 18, I don't think I stood out as much as I probably do now. But I've donated money. I have donated some time here and there. And when I hear people talk about things that they don't know anything about as it regards the black community, whatever, I will usually step in and say something. We have to find ways to basically give everybody a fair chance. I'm not going to say make everything equal because there's just too many forces against making everything equal. But we have to find ways to give people an opportunity to at least have a chance. And, you know, are there gangs? Yes. Are there ways to prevent gangs? I don't think so. I think, you know what, every type of neighborhood has some kind of gang. But if you can help people to feel empowered and feel like they have an opportunity, then there are going to be fewer people who are going to get in gangs. And there's going to be fewer people on welfare and fewer people on Medicaid. And you know what? The more diversity we have in a positive direction, the better the entire country is. And that's my thought for the day. And so I hope you got something out of the story. If you have any other questions about living in that kind of situation, by the way, part of that ended up hurting me as I went on through school later years, because it's hard not to go to class for an entire year and then all of a sudden have to go back to classes again when you move elsewhere. But that's a story for another time. I hope you enjoyed it. Y'all let me know. I hope you have a wonderful day.